While Emily Dickinson's poetry wasn't widely supported and accepted during her time, in recent generations many find themselves enthralled in her poetry. One can learn a lot about history from the written works of others, even when reading fictional works such as poetry. From reading the work of Emily Dickinson, there are several things revealed about the history of the United States through her poems. That is, if one can understand them in the first place. Dickinson's work was inspiring and engrossing, but was also consistently cryptic and therefore difficult to interpret, not merely because of her unique way of writing, but because the poet herself was a mystery to many. For starters, it was Dickinson's uncommon methods of writing that caused her work to be difficult to understand. An example would be how she consistently used the dash in her poetry, and this was considered perplexing to many. In fact, the dash that Dickinson has used in many of her poems has elicited frustration and criticism from some of her readers. For instance, in a poem she wrote to her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert Dickinson, she wrote, "Could I, then, shut the door, lest my beseeching face, at last, rejected be of her?" The poem was so short and only consisted of 16 words, and yet there were already 7 dashes throughout it, far more than the amount of dashes that many poets would use in poems twice or even 3 times as long as Dickinson's. Many considered the dashes in most of her poems to be excessively used and unnecessary as a result, complaining that it makes her work less enjoyable to read because it doesn't flow well and takes the focus away from what the poem is actually about. Other aspects that have made Dickinson's work challenging to understand would be her frequent mention of abstract concepts, such as life, death, and anger, which paves the way to various interpretations. While death can be written about in any generation, it was especially relevant in the 1800s because of how easily and frequently it would happen. Some of the common causes of early death would be through childbirth, leaving many children without their mothers, as well as the American Civil War that inevitably resulted in many casualties. In a book discussing the social themes and issues depicted in Dickinson's poetry, it was said that Dickinson's world was also traumatized by the untimely deaths of young men during the American Civil War, a subject which often enters her poetry. An estimated 500,000 soldiers died in the war. Afterwards, the author discussed how Americans had a tendency to romanticize the Civil War, and Dickinson did that with death. This is best exemplified in Because I Could Not Stop for Death, in which the poet began by writing, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality." In Dickinson's poem, she wrote about death as a character, which is not something that would be commonly found in other poets' work. She also wrote about him as being a gentleman who displayed chivalry, rather than something, or in this case someone, to be feared. But as with her other poems, this one led to many different interpretations, and to this day, there is still an ongoing debate as to what the poet's main message was. Some view it as an optimistic approach to death because of her acceptance towards it, while others view her romanticism towards death as proof towards her suicidal depression. While all poets have varying interpretations of her work, Dickinson's poetry is especially debated on because of her unique and convoluted way of writing. Another reason why the poet was so difficult to understand was because of the complexity regarding her family and personal life. What is considered to be one of Dickinson's most confusing relationships was with her mother, who she expressed ambivalence towards on multiple occasions. Her interactions with others, such as her father, friends, and siblings, were generally consistent, whereas the ones she had with her mother were unpredictable. While the poet didn't write many poems about her mother, it was through her letters that their erratic relationship was evident. Wolfe described the reality of the situation between them as complicated and contradictory. In talking about her mother, Emily Dickinson could give voice to affection, and along with this, there was Emily Dickinson's deep bitterness, the cryptic anger she occasionally expressed. This only adds to the poet's mystery because while it was clear through Dickinson's letters that she was upset at her mother, she never elaborated on why, which means historians can only speculate on the reasons behind her anger. Along with Dickinson's letters to her mother, the poet's letters to her sister-in-law, Susan Huntington Gilbert Dickinson, are also what caused confusion and debate between historians. Although most historians agree that Emily and Susan Dickinson had an affair, there is still an ongoing speculation about whether or not the two had a romantic relationship. And while there were many people in Emily Dickinson's life that influenced her writing, based off of her poems and letters, her sister-in-law was by far the one who she wrote the most about. This is evident through the preamble of one of Dickinson's letters that an editor, Emily Fragos, wrote, which was that her letter to Susan Dickinson was one of over 300 letters, more than any other recipient written to Susan Gilbert Dickinson, who would marry Austin Dickinson in 1856. This is significant because the poet wrote a copious amount of letters to Susan Dickinson, and yet there are still some historians who are unsure about the relationship between these two. Also, it was through the media's varying portrayals of Emily Dickinson that exemplifies the conjecture surrounding her work. Typically, historical pieces or films based off of historical figures have consistently depicted them, whereas Dickinson's life and personality has drastically varied in the media. The movie A Quiet Passion portrayed the poet as shy, lonely, and vulnerable, faced with the struggle of confronting the outside world, a problem that only worsened as she grew older. On the other hand, the movie Wild Nights presented Dickinson as carefree, rebellious, and more openly expressive than other historians have perceived her to be. There have only been 2 movies about Emily Dickinson, and yet both have depicted her in vastly different ways. And in an interview with Cynthia Nixon, who portrayed Emily Dickinson in the film A Quiet Passion, the actress shared her thoughts on the poet, discussing the likely reason why Dickinson's poetry was widely loved, and revealing that metaphors were the elements of her poems that were the most challenging to understand.
It's such an amazing story, especially for the fact that they didn't even find her stuff until after she died and all these volumes of her work. But what is it, do you think, that people relate to in her work and why she became so popular?
Well, she's so personal. She's so confessional without being confessional. Do you know, she leaves a lot shrouded in terms of the actual facts of what she's referring to. It's hard to know, the metaphors are so potent, but it's hard to know exactly all the time what they're metaphors for, but you know someone is speaking from a very deeply personal experience, and so that has a big impact on you, and then you're sort of free to interpret it in a lot of different guises, and yes. So you're able to graft your own stuff onto it, which is, you know, something that art does.
Yeah.
In addition to movies about Emily Dickinson, there has also been a show that is loosely based off of the poet, and this is titled Dickinson. Although this show was mainly intended for entertainment purposes and wasn't meant to have many historical accuracies, what is interesting about this show is that it offers a different and unique interpretation of Emily Dickinson. While there have been countless biographies and articles describing Dickinson as shy and reclusive, the show suggested something different about her. The show portrayed Emily Dickinson as headstrong, outspoken, and free-spirited, while the character was seen as frequently spending time in her room writing poetry. The show's interpretation of Dickinson suggested that the poet wasn't as quiet and withdrawn as many historians have speculated her to be. In a way, this show was like a mixture of the portrayals of Dickinson in both A Quiet Passion and Wild Nights with Emily. Like A Quiet Passion, the show depicted Dickinson as a suffering artist who was passionate about her poetry, and the theme of death was emphasized in both the show and the film. But on the other hand, similar to Wild Nights with Emily, Dickinson was also presented to have a humorous personality, as well as someone who not only expressed her most personal feelings in her poetry, but also to her friends and family. While there have only been a few portrayals of her in the media, all 3 of them have noticeably different interpretations of Emily Dickinson, and several of the actors who worked on the films and shows have revealed just how challenging it was to understand Dickinson's poetry and her life. To this day, there are still many questions about Emily Dickinson and little to no concurrence surrounding the answers. Through her letters, some are unsure of whether or not she had an affair with her sister-in-law Susan Gilbert Dickinson, and through her poems, some are puzzled about her stance on certain topics such as the temperance movement, the Civil War, and abstract concepts such as death and immortality. And after reading biographies about Dickinson, there is still much left unsaid about the poet because of how reserved, withdrawn, and cryptic she was about her poems, letters, and even interactions with her friends and family. But although one might have a difficult time interpreting her writing, through understanding even a little about her life, many have found themselves impressed by her dedication, inspired by her hardships, and connected to her poetry.